Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this event on what we should do with our public service media. It is part of this year's Media Democracy Festival, organised by the Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers and media practitioners to develop policies and campaign for media reform in a communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organisations and has much less plurality, diversity and accountability than we need. My name is Debs Grayson and I'm your chair today, and I'm the coordinator for a new campaign from the Media Reform Coalition called the BBC and Beyond, Reimagining Public Media. This event is doubling up as a launch event for the campaign, so I'm just going to say a few words about the BBC and Beyond. It's a campaign which aims to defend and re-envisage public media in the digital age. By public media, we mean our public broadcasters, the BBC and Channel 4, but also the independent and community media, which are often the most successful at truly living out principles of public service, creating media content that serves the public interest rather than the interests of governments or wealthy owners. Over the next few months, we will be holding a series of online events exploring what public media could or should be today. These will be announced shortly on our website and social media, so please keep a lookout for them. These discussions will feed into a manifesto for a people's media later this year, which we will be promoting with politicians and media practitioners in the build-up to the BBC Midterm Charter Review in April next year. I've asked the speakers today to suggest some of the most important policies they think would make our public service media fit for purpose in the 21st century. And I hope your questions can also help generate ideas for the manifesto for a people's media. I'm now going to introduce our fantastic panel of speakers, each of whom are going to speak for 8 to 10 minutes in the order that I'm introducing them, and then we will come together at the end for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the comment stream on the platform you are watching on, and we will take as many as we can in the time that we have. So we have Tom Mills, who is lecturer in sociology at Aston University. He's the author of the BBC Myth of a Public Service, and he will be followed by Pascal Robinson, who is a campaigns officer at We Own It, which campaigns for public ownership of public services. She has led campaigns such as It's Our BBC, calling for the BBC to be independent, publicly owned and funded, as well as accountable to citizens in public hands. And finally, we will have Clive Lewis, who was elected the Labour MP for Norwich South in May 2015. Before entering Parliament, Clive was Vice President of the National Union of Students, BBC TV political reporter, as well as an Army Reservist infantry officer serving a combat tour in Afghanistan in 2009. So Tom, do you want to begin?
Yeah, thanks very much, Debs, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here, and I think this is a really important topic. Whenever I've been talking about the BBC, I want people to get a sense of where we are. The current charter is guaranteed, but in 2027, that's when the current charter is going to come to an end, and that's when we should be thinking about how we might be able to reimagine and reform the BBC to create a new institution. And I think when we do that, we're going to want to bring it in step with changes that are going on in the wider media and political landscape. So I don't think we can just think about the BBC in isolation. We need to be thinking about what's going on in the wider society, what digital technology is doing to change the broader media ecology. The BBC and the other public media organisations need to keep in step with that, because the BBC, for all its failings, has been a resource against commercial interests and concentrations of social power. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that, which I talk about a lot, and I'm going to cover very briefly here. But I think even those good things about the BBC, which have been very seriously eroded in the last 30 years, would still need to be redeveloped and reinvigorated and reimagined to bring the BBC up to step with the contemporary and future technological developments. Now, I think starting with the political problems with the BBC, so these are relatively well known now. Sometimes I think there's a tendency for people on the left and just critics of the BBC in general to confuse symptoms and causes. Now, there are problems in terms of, for example, essentially cronies of the Conservative, the government, being appointed to key positions at the BBC. So we currently have a former Conservative as Director General, and somebody who's BBC chair, being appointed BBC chair, who's a Conservative donor and the chair of a Conservative think tank. Now, this is a serious problem, but this is a symptom of the more general problems with the BBC, which is the fact that it's basically not independent of the formal political structure. The fact that governments are able to appoint senior members to the BBC, the fact that the BBC is a very managerial, hierarchical organisation, the fact that the government is able to control the process whereby the charter gets renewed, the fact that the government is able to control the rate of the licence fee, which is the BBC's major source of income, these are all structural problems with the BBC that give rise to the problems which I think are well understood now, which is particular problems around the BBC being able to deliver on political impartiality, and that sort of cronyism at the top, a particularly kind of risk-averse culture. Now, we can see these things with the BBC in the way that it treats the current government, and the research on the BBC is very, very clear in terms of the impact that this has. It basically means that when it comes to key issues, the BBC isn't able to hold the powerful to account, which is actually required to do under its editorial guidelines. Those are the political problems. There are also cultural problems, I think, which are less well known, particularly in terms of how the BBC relates to the area of cultural production rather than news and journalism, which is what we tend to focus on. Now, what's happened over the last 20 years or so is you've had this commercialization of BBC programme making that starts in the 1990s and really became intensified actually under Tony Hall. And now we have a system whereby a lot of the programs you see on the BBC are being made by these large media multinationals, and the BBC is being integrated into that broader commercial ecology. Now, I think this is a serious problem. What do markets do for cultural production? They create risk-averse dross, basically, and there are pressures within international markets to be able to sort of have lowest common denominator production, something you can make a program here and you could market at lots of different places around the world. Program makers tend to imitate each other. It's a very closed world. Now, there are clear solutions to these kinds of problems. I think when we think about reimagining public media, we need to, first of all, and this is the basic stage, in my opinion, get rid of any governmental control over this organization. And that's not particularly radical. I think we should all be able to agree on that. For the BBC to be a basic liberal organization and do what it claims to do, it can't be in a position where basically people in the top are accountable to the government, who then define the editorial agenda that then filters down through the organization. So you get rid of any governmental control. Now, the question becomes then, okay, once you've done that, what will the mechanisms of accountability be? Now, I've been arguing for a long time that the accountability towards the political elites, which is basically the situation that we have, has to be replaced with accountability of various mechanisms towards the audience. This has to mean democratization. Now, I do think that this means democratization at the top, but I think that in a way, we need to think much more ambitiously about transforming the entire culture of public media. We do not want a top-down organization where the people at the top are simply elected. What we do want is devolved power within the organization that's more responsible to audiences, where boards that are making decisions are also going to be fully representative of the United Kingdom, right? So we don't want the same people who went to Oxford, white men, running boards at the top, even if they're elected. We have to have a much more representative organization. We have to have a democratically accountable organization. But I think meaningful democratization has to go hand in hand with the BBC adapting towards the digital media ecology. Now, the story of the BBC for the last 30 years has politically been a fairly miserable one. I don't think there's a lot of good to say about the BBC. It's generally gone from quite bad to much worse. And the reason for that is clear. It's because its independence has been eroded by government and it's being progressively integrated into markets. And that's reduced the independence of its journalism. It's reduced the capacity to make creative and innovative program making. And that is why what you see on the BBC, with some exceptions, gets worse. Now, the best bits of the BBC are the bits of the BBC where risks are taken and the program makers and journalists are free to be able to, in the case of journalists, ask difficult questions to those in power. In the case of program makers, produce innovative and exciting and engaging program making. We need to think about what kind of institution public media could be and how we could reimagine it. And that's what this campaign from the Media Democracy Festival is all about. Now, in my view, there's two key problems here which can be addressed together, and one is the power of these tech giants, which I think is now widely recognized as representing a threat to democracy. They control, they monitor our every interaction, our every statement online. They follow us online day in, day out. We are monitored with an intensity which is absolutely unprecedented. And of course, there's all kinds of issues in terms of like the distribution of misinformation and the rest of it, which are very familiar to everybody. Now, this is a huge concentration of social power in organizations like Google and Facebook and, some extent Twitter and platforms like that. The democratization of public media has to go hand in hand with developing an alternative public digital media as a response to the power of these tech giants. Now, in my view, that does mean developing more accountable digital structures. It means experimentations with democratization that don't just mean appointing people, but it means controlling the online environment in a collective way. Now, I think some developments from the BBC from this lamentable period in its history have been positive. So the BBC website, the iPlayer, these are important innovations in digital public media, which have been hampered, by the way, by Ofcom and commercial regulation, which basically says, look, if the public sector can do something, it shouldn't do it if it's going to interfere with private innovation. This is not the way to run a media system. You have to have a public first system, where the single question which should be asked is this in the public interest? Now, in my view, what we need to do here is we need to move beyond this idea of public service, where the great and the good at the BBC decide what it is we want, what it is that we should be watching, and what is news. We need to have this system devolved and democratized so that it has a much more interactive relationship with its audience. And I think that means experimentations with, participation by lot. It means things like democratic commissioning of the type of which my friend Dan Hine has discussed. It means localized boards and program making. It means devolving power away from Westminster and away from the centres of power in London, which is where currently the BBC is focused, and regional, and creating clusters of regional program making and journalism and expertise. It means commissioning, because I think what we want to do is we want to develop a broader, devolved and democratic media and cultural production, sector of media and cultural production around the UK. And we want to develop networks with public organisations in other countries so that we can share expertise, share culture, share journalism, share insights. This, to my mind, is what the future of public media looks like. The development of public service algorithms is a good step in the right direction, but I think what's being looked at there is basically a non-commercial alternative. I think that's the starting point for a conversation about what digital public media looks like, which has to move away from the patrician model and towards a participatory democratic ethos. And I think that's going to be a long process. But I think that's the conversation that we need to start to be having. We developed at the Media Reform Coalition some what we call draft proposals for BBC reform, where we start to develop those ideas. But the campaign is about the BBC and beyond. So this isn't just about the BBC. What we'd like to see at the BBC specifically is this kind of devolved structure, but which would develop networks and relationships with other organizations. So that means alternative models of ownership in and around this public media ecology. It means that you would take some of those historical examples from Channel 4, which had a sort of devolved producer ethos that again became less interesting and less critical as the indies started to develop into these super indies, these large multinationals that do a lot of the program production, and the ITV network, which was basically destroyed by Thatcher, but at one stage produced some really innovative dramas, documentaries, and journalism as well. That the basis of that was well-funded, devolved public media. That should be the starting point. That should be the inspiration. And then I think we can move beyond that when we start to think about what does digital media look like? So that's the start of the conversation, and those are some ideas I wanted to start the conversation with.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. Now let's hear from Pascal Robinson from We Own It.
Fab. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honour to be speaking with you three, who I think know so much and have done really important work on the media. So just to introduce briefly, We Own It campaigns against privatisation and for 21st century democratic, caring and participatory public ownership. We believe that public services belong to all of us, from the NHS and schools, council services to care, and we believe that we should own our media too. So we believe, of course, as I'm sure most everyone watching this believes, that access to information is in the same vein as access to healthcare. At their best, public service media is a significant force for education and helps us to understand our world and arguably more importantly, our place within that and what we can do to change it. We feel we have to transform our media if we're going to get the transformative changes to our society that we need. And we know that media affects the framing of issues and determines future discussion. There's a huge, for example, there is a huge appetite for a change in the way we run our economy. You wouldn't know this, though, from the way the media frames it. 6% of the UK public want a return to a pre-pandemic economy. That's according to Build Back Better polling. And polling also shows that over 3/4 believe that the NHS and our education is the same or has become worse in the last 10 years. We know that we simply won't get decent transport, a just transition, fast broadband and good hospitals and schools without public ownership. And a majority of the UK public have long recognised that. Public ownership is extremely popular across regions, social divides, political divides. Even a majority of Conservative voters want ownership of public ownership, of course, of rail and water. And our communities know that this is an agenda that will transform our society and bring people together. Public ownership also only increased in popularity during Corbyn's leadership. After 40 years of unthinking ideology, he brought that into the mainstream in the 2017 manifesto. Support for nationalising Royal Mail increased by 7%, and public ownership of buses increased by 9%. And this happened in the face of a barrage of right-wing media saying that Corbyn and McDonald's plans to copy countries like Ireland and France in running services directly was extreme and radical and really dangerous. But we know that this was simply a well-resourced lie. So we felt as an organisation that we had to do a campaign in 2020 on the media and democratising media ownership. And we somehow ended up a few months later with a campaign on the BBC. Of course, we're not in a world where the BBC is redefining how we understand our world and access to information. But as I've already mentioned, there is a wider question at play, which is about enshrining access to information as a public service. When debating defund the BBC's Liam Deacon on Talk Radio, I highlighted Curran's research, which shows that where independent and viable public service media exists, citizens are better informed about public issues. Liam Deacon, of course, scoffed at this. He asserted that media run for profit is no different to public media, and if anything, leads to you getting better media. And he also asserted that universal access to information was, if anything, patronising. That was a silly idea to the public. But I think I'm highlighting this to show what we're up against and why we decided to run a campaign for a publicly funded BBC that we can hold fully accountable, that is run for us. It's clear to all of us, I'm sure, that many in the government and outside of it want to dismantle our BBC, which would leave Rupert Murdoch's global media empire to benefit hugely. But however, we know that we simply cannot just defend the BBC. We will only be drowned out by defund the BBC. And what's more, we wouldn't want to defend the BBC in its current state. But we believe that we should make it better, fully independent of government, representative and accountable to us. It's a public service that we want to be proud of, and it does have world-class programmes and some services. For example, we need to remember, with everything that Tom just said, that millions did turn to the BBC every day, especially in those first kind of 6 months of the virus. It was a source of trusted information. Page views doubled in the 7 days around when the first lockdown hit. Meanwhile, the big tech companies scrambled around to counter misinformation. Across the pond, Fox News claimed that coronavirus was no more dangerous than flu, and that this was another attempt to impeach the president. The BBC organised religious services, fitness classes, regular phone-ins on local radios so that you could have your questions answered from experts on the virus. They opened huge amounts of programming to education classes for kids kept at home. And we must remember that they're building on the important work that they already do with services like BBC Bite-Size, which personally got me through my GCSEs. And by doing that, they're enacting their remit to serve every demographic in the UK, though of course this is by no means done well, but this does suggest what is possible, I think. We know that if we don't defend our BBC, Facebook and a Fox News style media will dominate even further, and they will change the frames in which we're discussing all of those issues that I discussed at the start of my talk. And I think it will damage the faint democracy that we do have and hand yet more power to billionaire moguls. So we know that the government has funded a cut of 30% cut since 2010. And we believe that we need to ensure that the BBC stays alive and of course that it serves us. So we think it needs to be independent. The board needs to not be appointed by the government, as Tom mentioned. And yeah, it's important to realise, I think, that we should put energy into that. That is worth campaigning for, and the more campaigning that's happening on that, the better. I think we also need a citizens panel that has members sitting on the very top BBC board that can hold the BBC to account on key issues like regional journalism and high pay. We think also that we need to uphold demands that the BBC stays a publicly owned and funded broadcaster that makes services and programs for everyone. So this does mean fair and sustainable funding. Of course, we need to make sure that the BBC funds services for low-income groups and over 75s. And if we want to talk about progressive ways of funding it, we could talk about a media tax levied on for every household and tiered by income. However, we think in this current context, we need to push for the reversing of funding cuts and, as I say, low-income groups having that licence fee paid for. Of course, there are many more exciting ideas as well. We think that a percentage of the BBC's budget could be spent on a voucher scheme. This would allow you to choose where your licence fee is spent, so you could platform cooperative, local, not-for-profit media or investigative work. We think that the public service algorithm is an interesting idea, but as Tom said, there's a lot more that needs to be done to really make it a public service. And we want to see all BBC archives and other public service media content made permanently publicly available. I think that we really need to campaign for media reform. I'm sure everyone agrees with that, but the more energy we can be putting into this, the better. Because we don't have another 4 years to wait for this. We need to change it now. And we saw that the misleading discussions around public ownership saturated the media during the last election are proof of this. In a world where even our beloved healthcare service is being privatised, instead of letting the BBC be murdered by Johnson and Murdoch, we demand that it be made better to serve us because it is something worth protecting. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pascal. And now we will hear from Clive Lewis.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. So I think the first thing to say is when we were talking about public service media, I kind of interpreted that as all media, because ultimately, as the so-called fourth estate, the role of media is to help with the smooth functioning and transmission of ideas within a democracy. Now, clearly that's not happening, not in a way that I think people would say was one which was helping democracy and helping our current system work effectively. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of take a step back and rather than specify individual policies, ask a series of more kind of fundamental questions. Now, I want to be really clear here. There are clearly differences between the private sector interest in media and what we know as public service media. But I guess what I would say is that all mass media platforms are in some way public, and they have an influence on our democracy. The term that Pascal used, fake democracy, I think is a feeling that is increasingly growing in this so-called crisis of democracy, that the democracy that we have isn't fit for purpose, that something is going on with it. How else do you explain the gross levels of inequality? How else do you explain democracies pushing our economies off of a cliff edge, pushing our life support systems, the ecology, the environment off of a cliff edge, when people clearly don't want that to happen? It still is. So there is something dysfunctional about our democracy. Lord Hailsham called it an elective dictatorship, which I can perhaps unpack a little bit later. So I just wanted to look at some more fundamental questions, as the politician on the panel, some more fundamental questions, which will hopefully tie into this whole discussion. And I guess the questions I'd ask is, what do we want from our democracy? What media systems do we need to have a functioning democracy if we don't think we've got one now? How do we get there? What is the role of public media in a democracy? Does our media live up to the expectations we have, or the needs of a democratic society? I would say currently, the answer to many of those is no. And if it is no, then we have to identify what we're going to do about it. Now, the power dynamics, the imbalance of power that we see in our media, including the BBC and public service media, is a mirror reflection of the dynamics in our politics, our economy, and our society. So we need to be realistic about the limitations and unintended consequences of calling for piecemeal reforms, given the systemic nature of what they're currently operating in. For example, should we really be calling for this government, who we know wants to limit free speech, to regulate the media? It's a question. I'm not posing any specific answer. I'm just putting it out there for the discussion. I mean, which kind of brings us back to whether our democracy is fit for purpose. Surely the answer is no, perhaps, if we can't trust the principal mechanism of governance, i.e. centralized, opaque government, to do so. It's something worth thinking about. So if we're looking at this, if we look at the context within which we're having this discussion, we are living and going through what is often termed the crisis of democracy. We have at present a pandemic. More than 1 million people around the world have died. Millions more have been infected, and many more are living with long-term health conditions, one created by a climate crisis. Inequalities have been entrenched domestically and internationally. There's been a rampant corruption in the doling out of COVID-19 contracts, and rich countries, including us here in the UK, are blocking the global south from accessing vaccines to protect the profits of the pharmaceuticals industry. We're also experiencing an ecological breakdown, of which COVID is a part of, which scientists have linked to the emergence of COVID-19. Biodiversity is collapsing. Our food chains are collapsing, and many species have been wiped out or on the brink of extinction. And this is made worse by the climate crisis. And the cause has been known for decades. And yet, is that this existential threat? Is that the narrative of our media? No, we're kind of, spend more time discussing millionaires in the royal family feuding. As important as some of the issues raised in that are, there does sometimes seem to me and to many others, I think, a lack of urgency on the issues, the existential threats that are facing us. So clearly there, we have a media that isn't up to standard, up to the job. So when we think this is the crisis of democracy, all of these, the rise of AI, surveillance capitalism, you've got the tech giants of Silicon Valley who see democracy as an obstacle to competing with Chinese firms, which benefit from the Chinese state's lax regulation of privacy rights for its citizens and human rights. When you look at this crisis of democracy, we see established institutions, and that includes the BBC, have failed to represent the public, to challenge economic self-interest in favor of the common good. The economic liberalization of the past 40 years has gone hand in hand with a retreat of democracy and a narrowing of our democratic imagination. And this is what has brought us to, I would say, the new Gilded Age, with a mass accumulation of wealth and power. And that power is increasingly unaccountable. And at the very same time, that mass increase in wealth and power is moving to, we know 5 billionaires that own a vast bulk of our media. So you can see it's a kind of unvirtuous loop. So if we look at the kind of the power and the democratic discourse that's taking place, the current media establishment, including much of the public media, has played an active role in creating this crisis of our democracy. The media and the government work in unison to create national narratives that are then used to justify anti-democratic policies. The Human Rights Act is only protecting terrorists, entrenched as a narrative to gut these protections. Activist lawyers intervening on deportation cases, entrenched as a narrative to roll back judicial review. The same power imbalances exist in social media. We might think that because everyone has access to social media, it's somehow more democratic. The reality is that social media platforms are being driven by advertising revenue and a desire to collect and harvest our data. The algorithms that determine the content we get are in effect a black box. So I think Tom's already picked up on some of the issues around that and ways that we could potentially tweak that, change it, kind of restore some balance. But I think we need to go further than that, and I'll come on to that in a second. So corporate advertising often accounts for more than 50% of revenue for media. That's going to have an impact. We know whether it's The Guardian, a so-called liberal publication, or The Telegraph, we know that, for example, HSBC has had a massive influence on how they've reported the potential wrongdoings of that bank. How can that be an open media platform which is going to give us the information we need to make decisions within our democracy? Let's go on to the decline of local media. And from 2005 to 2020, the UK had a total loss of 265 local newspapers. That's a phenomenal amount. And that means that there is no local accountability where people can have a say, can question, can see their MPs, their members of parliament, their councillors, can challenge their democratic representatives. We know an estimated 58% of the UK isn't served by any kind of regional newspaper. Now, that's a big problem. It also offers up opportunities for new, more democratic forms of media, which I think is something we could talk about as well. So what can we do from here? Where do we go? I think a reform agenda is in many ways academic until we're in a position to enact it and build a modern 21st century public service media as part of a broader democratic settlement. Now, to do that, we have to build and win power as an urgent priority. And then people, not just politicians, a political class, and vested interests, can decide democratically what media we need in this country. And to win power in the shortest possible time frame, that for me is how we're going to change this, how we're going to make fundamental changes to our democracy. Now, you know, I'm a bit like a stuck record. People know what I think about this. When you're looking at the cliff edges of the climate crisis, surveillance capitalism, of growing inequality, of the rise of authoritarianism, of the nativist right, when you look at those cliff edges and the clock ticking, we don't have time for the inevitability of socialism in many ways. It could take, you know, generations. We need to see this change now. And the way you do that is by building progressive and electoral alliances, committed to things like a constitutional convention, proportional representation as a key of that, and building a deeper, more fundamental democratic settlement in this country. And part of that will be a media narrative, will be about how we will build a public discourse around media and what kind of media we have. So in many ways, I think actually, let's not put the cart before the horse. We have to have power to be able to change and tackle vested interests. Now, there are things that we can do in the interim, but actually, I think that's where my priority is. And that would, I think, in the end, ultimately ensure that we had a democracy that had a media serving it that was fit for purpose.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for your contributions. And we've got a bunch of really great questions coming in. I'll kind of group them together under different themes, but I wonder if we can start just with, it's quite a kind of conceptual question in a way, saying, given that, I don't know, can we ever have public media? Surely media has to be partisan and for a specific audience, not everyone. So how do you understand public media?
Just for me.
Is this like a free-for-all, or we?
I'm happy
Maybe
to jump in.
I'll direct. Maybe I could start with Pascal, because you run a public campaign around this idea of the BBC. And how did you navigate some of these things around? You talked about it needing to serve all its audiences, but how do you deal with the fact that actually, you know, a partisan nature might be necessary, and that the public is not just one thing? You're on mute.
Yeah, it wasn't me.
A classic. I mean, the BBC obviously needs to do much better at serving all the UK. So Marcus Ryder talks a lot about how the BBC's funding priorities should match various different demographics. For example, the amount the BBC spends on productions produced by Black people is not good enough in any way. The same for disabled people. I think these are ways that we could make the BBC way more representative of the UK and better. I think that impartiality is a really difficult one, but I think Tom is probably better placed to talk about this. We have seen a total skewing of the discourse, of the way issues are handled. For example, in the 70s, there used to be industrial correspondents that would speak about trade union issues or disputes. That isn't the case now. And the BBC stats on having business voices is somewhat diabolical. It's embarrassing how much these voices are seen as the only valid opinions in our society. There's way more that the BBC could do to reflect a diversity of opinion and challenge the kind of status quo. But I think that it's not a case of, oh, well, it's really hard, let's not try. There's so many things that could be done, both small and big fixes. But I think onto the specifics, I'll let Tom and Clive speak more to that.
Should we let Tom go first? Sorry, Tom, I'm going to say that you go last.
Okay, sure, yeah. I mean, I think in some ways, yeah, I think in some ways this question, I mean, I think the basic answer is yes, you can have public media. We know we can because we've had it for a long time. This question of like, okay, what is the public and where, you know, how should different sorts of demographics or perspectives be represented it's not a new problem. And at one stage, you know, there was one channel which was the BBC, and then different sorts of channels and outlets start to develop, and they develop certain sorts of niches in the same way as private media does. What makes the BBC different is it has a remit to reach every single audience niche, if you like, or different perspectives. Now, I think it's important to remember that when it comes to the BBC and its obligation to impartiality, it's on controversial political issues that starts to kick in. So on cultural issues, really, which often, like when we see all this so-called culture war stuff around the BBC, it's like, oh, comedians are saying this, you know, because basically most comedians are sort of, you know, centrist, and the right don't like them. Now, that stuff's not so important. I think basically you have diversity of perspectives within a public organization with exactly the sort of democratic devolution that I and others on this panel have been discussing, right? When it comes to impartiality, my own view is that it's useful to maintain that this central principle. What journalists should be doing is they should be communicating the range of perspectives that exist in society on issues which are being discussed, right? So that principle of the BBC or other public media should offer the public a range of perspectives. You should be able to watch the news and understand what is at stake in different political issues. That's all you need when it comes to impartiality, for the different perspectives to be fairly represented and communicated to audiences. The BBC and the media in general don't do that. There's lots of reasons why they don't do that. One of which is some of the structural issues we've been discussing, and the other is that some interests in society just have more voice and power than others, so they tend to dominate and manipulate the political conversations. So I think, you know, we shouldn't think of like public media as necessarily meaning, oh, we're going to treat all audiences as homogenous. In my mind, what's important is that you have universal access. So everybody has access to this single sort of public resource, right? And everybody equally contributes and shapes the nature of the different perspectives that appear. This should help us understand each other and understand our perspectives, right? This is what they don't have in the US. They don't have that central place where different people from different perspectives can meet. And I personally think it's useful for us to think about this notion of public media, because people, particularly on the left, are very used to the idea of, oh, movements need to have their own media, and they absolutely do. But I still think that the sort of broader democratic transformation of the type that Clive's been talking about has to have a public infrastructure, because that's the principle of democracy. It's not that you have little niches of interest. You're also able to, those different conflicting interests in society exist, but there is a common language that allows us to negotiate those different conflicting interests, and that's where this sort of, you know, vague notion of the public kind of kicks in. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, really.
Clive, did you want to answer that as well? Or?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I guess the question is, how are we defining kind of public media? And I know Tom's just given an explanation there, but there is also another definition, which is that the media, you know, if you've got mass media platforms like big newspapers, like Murdoch's broadcast empire and so on, then there is a sense that they are public, in the sense that they are communicating with the public on a mass platform. Clearly, people are going to have different opinions. But I think if we're talking about a democracy where you don't just have a kind of ruling elite or a political class, actually, if we're talking of moving away, and look, not everyone's going to agree with it. Some people are quite happy with the current system, status quo. I'm not. I'd like to see a system where there is more direct democracy, where people do have more time on their hands, more ability to be able to engage in having control over their lives, their communities' lives, on a smaller scale, you know, closer to home. And I think if you have that, then you're going to want, in many ways, the role of the media that you're going to want to consume, to be able to make informed decisions about the new power that you have as someone who can actively participate, that participative democracy, which is what I would like to see. You're going to want to know certain things about how certain things are working so that you can make more informed choices, other than just simply having an opinion that you can bang out on social media and then form a political opinion to tell someone else or ask someone else to go and operate on your behalf. So I think, you know, how media will be in the future, public media will be, I think, will change depending on what kind of democratic system we have and the degree to which it is representative and the degree to which it is a direct democracy. So that's one thing. But I also think as well, there has to, I think as well, with the large kind of media platforms, which do have an influence on the public through their transmission of information and biases and so on and so forth, there is a problem in the sense that we do have inequalities of power within our society. And they have a lot of it, and we have a little of it. And they're trying to hold on to the lot of it and keep us with a little of it. And in that sense, there's an unequal relationship, power relationship. And I think that has to, if we can tackle that, then I think we can begin. And that's obviously why I'm in politics, to begin to tackle those power imbalances. If you can tackle that, then it's not, I don't have a problem with people having other political opinions. If you want, you know, power to be in the hands of a few, fine. That's you're entitled to express that and to say that. But I think it's all of the power and the wealth that comes behind that, which gives that imbalance. So I think it's really clear. What I'm not saying is everyone has to have the same opinion, but I just think let's have those opinions, and let's have those opinions backed by a more even balance of power, and then you can have the different opinions within your society. At the moment, we don't have that.
Yeah, just to add to that, if I may, I think it's really good. And I just, you know, what does public mean? I mean, in this context, I think it means that those concentrated powers are not able to manipulate the conversation. So it doesn't mean homogenizing all political difference, but it does mean that you can't transfer that social power that you have in society to dominate the public conversation. Yes. So what does public media do? It offers us greater equality to resolve and communicate our political differences.
I guess my point off the back of that is it's trying to fix the media without reallocating power within our democracy. In many ways, it's not going to be a permanent fix. So it's like trying to say, right, let's kind of rebalance our media, our public media, but still keeping the power imbalances. Because I think some people think that by changing that, it will change this. Well, it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, I do admit that. But I think there is also something to be said for actually having a democratic system, political change, which actually begins to kind of even out those political imbalances of wealth and power, which then I think, you know, you can also, does that make sense? So just changing the power imbalance in the media, you also have to change the power imbalances in the reality that we inhabit within this current paradigm, democracy that we have. So we have to do both. But I agree, it's not homogenizing views. That's what the right will claim it is. It's not. It's about balancing up the power dynamics. And at the moment, they're not very equal.
Interesting in the way, Clive, you talk about, like, once an institution reaches a certain size, Like, what obligations go alongside with that, and does it have to become public in order to not become another concentration of power, as we've seen with the tech giants? And I think some of those arguments of, you know, Google being a public utility, Facebook in some ways being of public utility, they have that ubiquity, and it's almost impossible to not be part of it. So therefore, there needs to be public accountability and control. Okay, we've got a few questions about funding and the license fee. So asking whether it's justifiable that people go to prison for it, saying it's a regressive tax, and also asking about more progressive forms of funding, but also whether we can ever trust the BBC actually to handle our public money. And I guess this is again one of those kind of chicken and egg situations. Like, how do you? I guess it'd be great to hear from you about what you see as the best alternatives to the license fee, but also how we build public support for that in a context where trust in the BBC is declining. Pascal, do you want to start?
No, Pascal.
Yeah, Fab, thank you. So, of course, no one should be going to prison for not being able to pay the license fee. That's really regressive, and I don't think we want to see more people being pulled into the justice system and being taken to prison. We need to reduce those systems and reduce the amount of money that they have. There are, of course, way more progressive ways of funding the BBC. There is a levy that you could tax per household. You could call it the media fund. I think Tom might have specifics on how we could do this better. And I think it's a really valid question that someone put in the chat about how it can ever be really independent if it is essentially the state that is collecting that money. They can affect the level, even as we're seeing, as I mentioned in my talk. So I think there does need to be really big questions about how we set that level. I believe the Media Reform Coalition has ideas about an independent regulator that would decide the level it should be set, so that we could, so that media would be funded enough and fairly. But I think there's also a bit of work there. If we are going to be less carceral in the way that we demand people give their money for media, then we need to build public support. And that's why this work of asserting that public media and public information is a public good, it's vital to attaining any sense of democracy and any sense of a collective of us trying to do stuff together, is vital. So that needs to be communicated all the time. In the same way the GLC, the Greater London Council in the 70s and 80s was doing so much work to say, we're doing this progressive work, and we're going to tell you about it all the time. In terms of, can we trust the BBC to spend our money well? Again, I think this is an area where we could be using the anger that we've got to make the BBC better, and we need to get organised. I really agree, Clive, that this is a chicken and egg situation, but as I said, I don't think we've got time to wait for democracy to get better before we start campaigning on our media. I would really encourage everyone to get involved in the Media Reform Coalition's, Debs's campaign, the BBC and beyond. There are going to be events all around the country, virtual, hopefully real, and we need to be speaking to people and building those alternatives. We can't underestimate what organising, what effect that has, as we've just seen this week with the amazing work of Sisters Uncut. So, to answer the question that I've really gone on a tangent with, can we trust the BBC with our money? Yes, but we need to, well, no, not at the moment, but we need to demand that it is more accountable to us. We need to have the BBC bring productions in-house as well. And that would also lead to better jobs as well. So many journalists are employed. I've got friends employed on really temporary bad contracts, constantly worried about having enough money. And so the BBC is another great way of boosting our economy as well. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pascal's covered everything I want to say, really. I mean, there are different ways that you can collect the tax which wouldn't be regressive. In terms of like people being going to prison for non-payment, I mean, I think in a way the rights just sort of shifted this conversation. The question is, should people who don't pay taxes be put in prison, right? So this is, we would want a tax to fund a public service, and then how do you deal with non-payment? That's not a separate issue for the BBC. If we have a tax for something, that means that we require the payment, and that's the universal requirement. Now, it is a regressive tax, so then we just deal with that with, as Pascal has said, what we propose at the Media Reform Coalition is a digital license fee, so it's not attached to the license to television receiving equipment, which is anyway something that the BBC has already done. That's more sort of symbolic, really. Most other countries have moved away from the license fee as a model. So for years and years, for the BBC, this was just, and its sort of hardcore supporters, this was like, you know, this sort of holy principle that you can't get rid of the license fee. But most of the arguments around that were completely bogus. And I don't think we need to be afraid of saying that something is regressive if it's a flat tax. I mean, it just obviously is. So we just need to do something about that. Just briefly, as I mentioned about, like, you know, in response to what Clive said about, I guess, like, you know, a movement for government so that reform could be implemented. I mean, this is about building up an agenda so that when what Clive's been talking about has been achieved politically, there's a movement behind that with a set of principles for what media would look like. So they run in parallel with each other. And I think Clive was absolutely right when he emphasized like how, you know, you have to have social change running sort of in parallel. You change the media, but you need to change society. Otherwise the media is basically not going to change, because of course it's part of those same networks of political influence. And then, sorry, I was just going to say, just briefly, there's no magic way that you're going to make it more independent. Yeah, you have to have like an arm's length regulator that's going to have a set of public principles on which they decide how to set the rate of the license fee. What you want to do is remove it from basically the Prime Minister or the Chancellor just deciding and using political threats to limit public media's capacity. We've seen this again and again. You know, it's not controversial anymore. It's public what Boris Johnson said to Channel 4 and the conversations that George Osborne had with the BBC. So you need to have an independent body that's going to make those judgments, and then we would want mechanisms of democratic accountability there as well.
I'm sorry, Pascal, if I kind of, and to the viewers and listeners, if I kind of implied that we shouldn't be campaigning for these things and working towards them. I think Tom got the balance right. It's about doing both, and it's about having an agenda ready to go. And that, you know, if and when you get the democratic changes that you want to see. So yeah, it's about going hand in hand. I think on the issue of the license fee and alternatives to funding it, and I'm a kind of a big supporter of universal basic income, universal basic services, and it's a principle basically, which is if you can accept the principle of private inheritance, then there's a concept we can call social inheritance, which is basically that we and our forebears have all contributed to also people across the global south, but let's not open that can of worms. But nonetheless, we've all contributed to making this country what it is, the wealth that currently exists today. It's not just the class of capitalists that have done that. We've all done it. And therefore, there is a social inheritance. And you can begin to then look at what kind of universal basic services as well that we would like to see. And, you know, in the last Labour manifesto, we were talking about a universal basic service of broadband, which I think after the pandemic didn't sound such a bad idea after it was called communism and the like by others during that general election and afterwards. So there are clearly things, physical things, food, water things, which people have a right to. And so there is an argument that we should collectively be able to make sure that everyone has provision to that. And I would say in a functioning democracy, access to entertainment, news, that public resource is something that should be there for everyone. And as a universal basic service, that's how it should be funded, through general taxation, also through our country's ability to be able to afford those services and to do that. And I think that's something that we can think of. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you know, the taxation component that the government gives to the BBC, which is in effect meant to be the license fees collected, and then they get an agreement from the government, and then the government give them some money. I mean, ultimately, you know, most people understand that taxation isn't required, you know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer isn't waiting for you to pay your tax bill before he can pay nurses, before he can give money out to the BBC. It's not how it works. Actually, taxation is about a means of buying people into the system, taking excess kind of demand out of the system as well. It can also be a way of rebalancing power within a society, within an economy. So ultimately, I think, look, if you're going to have a system of funding the BBC, which is fair, which doesn't see people go to prison, I think there are other ways that we can go about that. But the key thing for me is people should have, no one should be paying anything. And there's no taxation, no license fee without representation. So without being able to have a real democratic, direct say in what goes on in there, whether that's voting for the Director General, whatever it is, there needs to be a component of democracy in there if we're paying for something. And again, if it's a universal basic service, we are still paying for ourselves, through our resourcefulness, for our productivity. Again, you need that democratic component in there.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth saying as well that there are these other possibilities for funding in terms of taxing the big tech giants, creating new sources of money that then could be used to support public interest journalism outside of structures like the BBC. And there's many ideas that have been kind of worked up around that. We're coming towards the end, and I guess maybe if you could answer very briefly, we've had a question here about whether we should just let the Tories destroy the BBC. And I think it sounds from what you're saying that you all think no, but I do think that this is a very challenging moment to be trying to defend the institution. And I wonder what each of you think are the most powerful argument that you have in your array for like why we shouldn't let the Tories destroy the BBC.
I'm going to be a diva and ask that I don't go first this time.
I'll be quick and come out, and I'll be quick and because I know Tom's got some good stuff to say on this. I think we should defend the BBC, not on the grounds that not as it's currently structured and as it currently works. I mean, part of me wants to defend the BBC because the Tories so many on the right want to destroy it. That for me is enough of a reason to want to hold on to the BBC. But clearly, I need to give a better answer than that. Simply that the right want it, so we don't. But the answer I would give is, look, the BBC. I mean, if I've read Tom's book, and the BBC is an institution in that classical aristocratic kind of almost 19th century way. It was established as it's established to help smash the 1926 general strike. Let's be really clear here. When it was started out, it was no friend of the working classes. And yet, as our society, as our economy has transmuted into the welfare state, it became an integral part of public service broadcasting, and it's become a national institution. And there are certain things about it, certain values, certain qualities, which I think we want to keep. And I think it would be a backward step if we allow all of it, the good and the bad of the BBC, to be. I worked there for 12 years. There's good stuff in the BBC, there's bad stuff in the BBC. And it would be a mistake, it would be a strategic error for us to allow the right to destroy that, because it would put us on the back foot. So what little good there is in our media ecosystem, and some of that is in the BBC, would be annihilated, and we would be even further back. So I think it's about acknowledging the BBC, acknowledging its weaknesses and its strengths, and defending those strengths, but saying we're not talking about simply defending the BBC as is. We're talking about defending the best principles and values of the BBC, and then building on them for a wider public media ecosystem.
Do you want me to go next? Yeah. So I mean, I understand the sort of the mood around this, but I think it's extraordinarily ill-judged position, like strategically, politically, to say we don't like this institution because it was terrible to Labour in the last general election because it's stuffed full of Tories at the top, and therefore just let it burn. Look, the problems with the BBC are specific problems that we can address. We start from the principle of what kind of media structures do we want, and then we work from there. Now, that, as Clive said, the BBC embodies certain good principles, which I think we should be defending, and it does some good things, right? And it does some very, very bad things as well. And most of it's political journalism. It's just kind of embarrassing. But like, you don't look at that and say, oh, let's just get rid of this entire public infrastructure. That's like saying, oh, you know, the Tories have appointed this healthcare guy head of the NHS. Well, just let the NHS burn. I mean, this is crazy. Just think about it strategically. I mean, Clive's already made this point. It's going to be much more difficult for the kind of government that Clive's been alluding to when it comes in to be able to rebuild this infrastructure from scratch. And also, I think it's useful for us to remember that the people at the BBC who are like the public face of the BBC, and I won't name names because it just sort of feels rude somehow, but like, you know who I'm talking about. These are the 1% of the BBC. I mean, look at the salary scales at the BBC, and look how much they get paid, and look how much everyone else gets paid. That tells you something, right? The BBC in some ways is like Britain in a microcosm. There are people at the top who get paid enormous amounts of money, who dominate the conversation at the BBC and set the editorial policy. You don't say, to hell with the rest of this institution. You hold on to this critique as to what's wrong with it, and you think about, okay, so what kind of institution do we want? I think we want one radically different, and I'm arguing for that. But the basis for that is on some of the principles which the BBC already embodies, and or at least claims to embody. And it is a public, for all its faults, it is a public infrastructure that, in theory and in principle, belongs to us and not to the government. And that should be the start of our critique, not to just say, we don't like this institution because of X, Y, and Z, therefore to hell with it. Remember that it's a small number of people at the top of the BBC who are doing what they're doing. And there are very specific reasons for the problems that we have with the BBC. And we can address those problems. We can transform this institution. But I think it would be very fatalistic to just simply throw your hands up and say to hell with it.
Okay, Pascal, do you want to have the last word? You're on mute again.
This is the worst. This has happened twice. Apologies. Yeah, so I'm going to kind of echo what the other two speakers, Tom and Clive, have said. I think we also need to campaign for it as a public service. And I think we need to bring some of the ambition that we bring to our other campaigning around public services to the BBC. You know, we talk about the NHS as based on the ideal of solidarity. And I think that there is some excitement and some energy that we can inject into our campaigning around the BBC in calling for something that is exciting and is sharing information and is transformative as well. So you know, I think there's loads that can be done. I wish that we only had more capacity to campaign around the BBC. For example, like that web page where there's just the list of all the director generals, and it's all these like white men with red faces. Like there's so much that we can do to be challenging the BBC as it currently stands and make it what it should be, which is about sharing information and learning about the world in order to change it. And I really look forward to working with everyone listening on this call and the amazing speakers to getting us there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So yeah, just to reiterate for anyone that missed the beginning, this is also kind of doubling up as a launch event for a new campaign from the Media Reform Coalition called the BBC and Beyond, Reimagining Public Media. We will be running a series of events throughout the next few months, and those will be announced shortly on our website and social media. So please keep an eye out for those. A huge thanks to all our panelists today, and thank you for joining us and being part of this really important conversation. The Media Reform Coalition is also a voluntary organisation that survives mostly on thin air and some kind donors. For these debates, as part of the Media Democracy Festival, we would like to acknowledge the support of Byline Times, the Independent Media Association, The Canary, Squawk Box, Bywire News, Manchester Meteor. And if you would like to support the work of MRC, then please follow the links on the closing slide. Thanks very much.